Well, I'm here with Iain Morrison. He's come all the way from Scotland to talk about Horace Gregory.
Yeah, that's the sole purpose of my trip.
We shouldn't be satirical.
No, I'm really happy that I'm getting this as a bonus thing on the end of my week of Emily Dickinson absorption.
I think we should just say, kind of a behind-the-scenes thing, which we don't do much in ModPo videos, but Iain was finishing up a series of many programs and sitting in the kitchen of the Kelly Writers' House when I passed by and thought, oh, he should join this conversation about Horace Gregory. So thank you for doing that.
Well, thanks for letting me crash it, Jonathan.
And John Hoel, who came all the way from Amherst, Massachusetts to be with us. And it was John. You want to tell the story of how we came up with this idea?
Yeah, I came upon Al's book on Wallace Stevens' modernism from right to left.
Oh, I have a copy.
Right, good, yeah. It's a really great book.
Oh, thank you.
And it's one of the only books that I've ever been able to find that has information about Horace Gregory, who's a poet that we're talking about. And I was so relieved that you're alive, because a lot of people...
I'm alive?
Yeah, because a lot of people that have written about Horace Gregory are not alive anymore. And so because he was a poet in the 1930s, and the generation that wrote about him tends to be also from the 1930s.
And that's either because the old left is so not interesting once the new left came and complicated our relationship with the old left. And then, of course, there's communism and anti-communism. There's all kinds of reasons why Horace Gregory is forgotten, but he was quite famous and important at a certain point.
That's right, yeah. I mean, he was, I would say, as notable a poet as anybody else in the contemporary modernism, like the sort of, we think of as like high modernism, that he was sort of, he met with Yeats on several occasions. He was very good friends with Kenneth Fearing, Muriel Rukeyser.
Yeah.
He and his wife, Maria Zatroneska, sat with like all
you
of
say Maria or Mariah?
I think it's Maria.
Maria Zatroneska, who was born in Kiev.
Kiev, yeah. She's a Ukrainian immigrant to the country.
Yeah.
And she won the Pulitzer Prize for her book Cold Morning Sky.
Exactly. And they together wrote a book called A History of American Poetry, 1900 to 1940, which for me was like a Bible when I was writing a book about the 1930s.
Yeah.
So, so anyway, so what happened
next? So serendipitously, you were going to be at MLA last January.
The Modern Language Association conference.
Right, which was here in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
So you didn't have to travel very far, I guess. But so I emailed you out of the blue, which I've done a couple of times, and usually people are fairly busy and don't respond, and you responded, which is really exciting.
Don't respond?
Well, sometimes.
I think we should. I address myself directly to people who are watching this video. If you ever receive an email from someone interested in your passionate topics, answer the email. Okay.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I did the same with
you.
You
did, that's a good maxim, yeah.
But this is also dangerous, because now people know that you're very, you're going to get all these emails.
But the only
now.
people who ever watch these videos are ModPo people,
Okay,
and they already know that I'm insanely responsive.
Secret's out. Yeah.
So anyway, we met for breakfast, and we agreed to do two things. One, a poem talk about Horace Gregory, which we're going to do, let the record show, after this session, a little later. And to do a ModPo video, which will fit in Chapter 5, the first part where we consider so-called communist poets. So we'll get right into the poem, John. Okay. And then, of course, what's going to happen is inevitably we're going to try to understand. We'll understand the poem, but we'll understand where this possibly could fit within the liberal left, even particularly communist-affiliated poetry world, and why it might even seem like it belongs there or why it doesn't, and what's it look like from all these years later. As a matter of fact, we had one of the many topics we talked about last night over dinner was Sean Bonney, who has a relationship with what might be called, or had before his death, a relationship with what might be called the communist left.
Yeah,
that's
for sure.
And Sean Bonney, cared a lot about this discussion about poetry and the left. Sometimes Sean Bonney would say, it's bullshit, poetry can't do anything, right?
Right, yeah.
And then sometimes he'd go out there and behave as if it could.
Yeah, thank God he did, because he resonates through a lot of what's happening and what motivates some of the poets of the left in Britain now and elsewhere. I'm sure.
Yeah. And he died before Brexit, maybe, or around the time.
He died after the vote, but in the middle. I think.
But all those issues were very
2020.
much.
He died.
And the reason why it's good that we're digressing about Sean Bonney, other than to make sure Iain feels included in the conversation, is that ModPo Plus includes a video about a couple of Sean Bonney's poems made in London with some friends of Sean Bonney.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, it's really good. And
So
that's,
I highly recommend that.
Is that
video.
week 5 then as well?
It's in week 5. It's right here.
Yeah, so totally get. Okay,
It'll be right next to this.
Oh, that's great.
Okay, perfect.
I should say one of the professors I work with at UMass Amherst, Ruth Jennison, she's, I believe, editing a collection of essays that's going to come out in sometime in the next couple of years about Sean Bonney's poetry from numerous
so the loop
leftist
is
scholars.
being closed. I'm so glad that we did this huge digression at the beginning of what is typically a video where we get right into the
Oh
poem.
God, I'm sorry.
But no, isn't that what the so-called social poetry is supposed to do?
That's what it does. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, okay. So I'm going to read the poem, and then the three of us are just going to talk. Let the record show. I have no notes. Iain definitely has no notes because Iain just joined us. And John, too. So this is like the way discussions should happen, I think. Okay, here it goes. Published in Poetry Magazine, February 1930. That'll be a topic of conversation, too. One of 4 poems published in the issue of February 1930. And this one is called Interior, the Suburbs. There is no rest for the mind in a small house. It moves, looking for God, with a mysterious eye fixed on the bed, into a cracked egg at breakfast, looking for glory in an armchair, or simply noting the facts of life in a fly, asleep on the ceiling. The mind, sunk in quiet places, like old heroes, sleeps no more, but walks abroad in a slouch hat, performing adultery at violent street corners, then, trembling, returns, sadly directs its mysterious eye into a coffee cup. There is no rest, for there are many miles to walk in the small house, traveling past the same chairs, the same tables, the same glassy portraits on the walls, flowing into darkness. There is no victory in the mind, but desperate valor, shattering the 4 walls, disintegrating human love, until the iron-lidded mysterious eye, lowered carefully with the frail body under churchyard gardens, stares upward, luminous, inevitable, piercing solar magnitudes on a fine morning. John, there is clearly a straightforward, even pedestrian's the wrong word, domestic, plain domestic setting. And then there's a lot of mystery as well. So it's working on 2 registers. I'd love for the both of you, starting with John, just to speak to that whole issue. At first, a reader of poetry might have thought, oh, this is a social poem about, someone that the speaker is seeing living in a house.
Yeah. Yes. I think Gregory is sort of a fascinating poet for the left because he's complicated. He's not Kenneth Fearing, who I love Kenneth Fearing, but Kenneth Fearing is
much more experimental too.
Yeah, but he's also very much writing a proletarian poetry, and it reads that way. And Gregory's very careful to never call himself a proletarian poet. Mostly, I mean, he's not proletarian for one thing, but he calls himself a social poet. And there's this distinction. I think it's because he's a classicist as well as being a poet of the left in the 30s, that he has this very traditional relationship with English poetry, with Byron and Tennyson, and that comes across in the way that his sort of usage of language is not the same as a lot of his contemporaries. And I think my mind is most drawn in by moments like the iron-lidded mysterious eye. It's just not a phrase you encounter in a lot of...
It's almost ancient in its epithetic quality. The iron-lidded, it's almost Homeric.
Yeah. But on the other hand, the suburbs as like a subject matter feels very, very, very of the moment.
So many communist poets or social poets wrote about the suburbs and about homes, houses, and in fact, in ModPo, in the main syllabus, we have Genevieve Taggart's poem, Interior, which is exactly the same thing about a middle-class person, a woman who's sitting there while the streets are roaring with people who are not allowed to get into the house. So it's a real trope of the left.
Yeah.
Although this precedes that. This is 1930.
Right.
And those tropes are 1935, 1936.
It's good. It's good. Those are good twin poems though, because they actually both Taggart and Gregory taught at Sarah Lawrence College at the same time. So.
And you have a connection to Sarah Lawrence.
I got my MFA at Sarah Lawrence College.
Oh, this is all threaded together. Iain, sorry, go ahead, John.
I was just going to say that's where I first encountered Horace Gregory. I was taking a poetry seminar with Marie Howe, and she wanted us to read Metamorphosis, and she wanted us to read Ted Hughes's translation of it. But I had gotten the cheapest copy that I could online, and instead of the Ted Hughes translation, I received Horace Gregory's translation.
And the Black Flop said that he was
from Sarah Lawrence,
professor of Sarah Lawrence,
where I was at physically. So it was kind of a strange coincidence.
And don't ever let it be said, Iain, that the poetry world is not small.
No.
Because even you, coming across the pond, you're already completely threaded in.
Yeah.
All right. Anyway, my question, John gave us an incredibly good start, which is we've got two registers. One is a scene, a social scene, and social observation, and the other is mysterious eye, and there's obviously some God in there. What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the thing that I keep getting the image in my head, is it the Masonic symbol that's got this eye at the top of a triangle? That's what I always think of with like a...
It's in the U.S. Bills,
Yeah,
dollar, the
yeah.
dollar, I think. Right?
Yeah, that's what because it's singular, there's this kind of weird kind of layering of that symbol into the domestic as well. I mean, I know that it's a, I always get metonyms and whatever mixed up, but like standing in for both eyes or the gaze or whatever.
Metonym is good enough.
Yeah, but it's and this the syntax of that bit also kind of throws me off a little bit because it moves looking for God with a mysterious eye fixed on the bed, and then is it the eye that's still also looking into a cracked egg at breakfast, looking for glory in the armchair. I mean, I'm getting this big sense of lassitude, which makes sense because then the next verse picks up the kind of sleeping no more. My takeaway from my first reading was throw off your comfort and kind of get radicalized, kind of
absolutely
thing, because it's like sure, it might be tempting to lie down, have a nice breakfast, and look for glory in the armchair, obviously heavily ironized.
It's satirical. The speaker brutally satirizes the suburbanite, right? I mean, that's what we should say for starters.
Sure.
Right. This is a leftist poem in which the suburbanite is found to be incredibly inadequate. And I think, John will turn to you after this provocative comment I'm about to make, but I think that Gregory, who was very much steeped in an Eliotic kind of modernism, because there's a lot of Eliotic lines here, right, is turning that around toward the left. And, William Cross Williams was very critical of Eliot for poetic reasons and not so much political reasons at this point. Gregory is critical of Eliot for political reasons. If an Eliotic poem, I guess counting out the hours in coffee spoons, I'm getting that all wrong. He's turning that around and accusing the Eliotic of missing what's going on outside the house. That was provocative, John.
Yeah, and provocative. I think that's an accurate reading of. I mean, I haven't seen Gregory be overtly critical of Eliot in a sort of direct way, but in this kind of like a, I don't know, maybe more subliminal, or I guess like a subtweet or something. Sort of like a informal attack. It is interesting. I mean, I think for the period, Pound is so much the poet that's targeted for attacks, and maybe Wyndham Lewis, and you don't necessarily hear Eliot being attacked in the same way as like the conservative or fascist poet.
Later, yes.
Later, certainly, but for the moment, it's less common as for a poet, especially in the New York, New England circles, to be, I think, outwardly critical in that same way. I mean, maybe in like a review of a new book, but
Yeah.
but I know that later in the decade, Gregory and his circle were all enamored with four quartets when it comes out. They all love it.
I
So
bet.
think,
But by that time, the ideological position
yeah,
moved
he shifts. Yeah,
very
he,
much so. I mean, he rebuked the communists by the end, probably the end of the 30s, maybe early 40s.
Yeah,
Gregory did.
he does an issue of Harriet Monroe's poetry magazine. He edited it, and it's called The Social Poets Number. And it was actually the first time anyone had ever edited it before her, other than her, I mean. And then she died, and then it became very common. But he was the first person to do it, and in the issue, he refers to himself as not a communist. He says he's a Christian socialist. He's very, very emphatic
He's being
about that.
very careful.
So that's 36. So I think even halfway through the decade, he starts to shift
I think
further.
she dies in 35. Or 36.
It could have. I think it's the same year she dies, but it's the beginning of the year.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So, I mean, here's where we should we'll turn back to you, Iain, to talk about the space here, because this is an interior. But just a footnote, Poetry Magazine by 1930 is thought of by second or third generation avant-garde or experimental modernists in the U.S. anyway as falling behind, as kind of dominated by the, I hope you will forgive this phrase, but what used to be called the blue-haired ladies from St. Louis, wealthy poetic matrons who were really into, they thought Pound was a little scandalous, and what we really needed was, poems about fields and getting fresh air in the Southwest, stuff like that. And they liked imagism so far as it would go, but by this point, people are doing other things. And of course, you have people like Zukofsky who are breaking into poetry in 1931. And so poetry began to be seen as staid as Harriet Monroe herself aged. And so this was a negotiating strategy, partly, to bring Gregory in to do the Social Poets Number. That would be my read.
I think that's accurate.
Yeah.
It's worth noting, while I'm just sort of spouting off trivia about Horace Gregory, he was supposed to be included in the famous Objectivists issue that Zukofsky.
Was?
He was. And
Hardly an objectivist.
He sent a poem in, and Zukofsky had intended to include it, but it did not arrive in time. And so he was forever left off that grouping.
Well, maybe
but he doesn't read like an objectivist.
Never have been included.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense, but it's an interesting tidbit.
Maybe Louis just didn't open the mail.
Could be purposefully.
Saw
maybe.
it was Gregory. Scandalous, this conversation.
Yeah.
All right, Iain, let's talk about the space, because the interiorization is very important.
Yeah, I'm getting a claustrophobia that makes me think actually of Wilfred Owen. Do you know his poem about like the ghosts that sleep on the palace walls and don't step out of their portraits and shadows, which makes sense timeline wise, that we're in that kind of post World War I moment where there's been a bit more of a lie given to the glory of fighting for a cause, a nation or whatever. So there's, I don't know, I guess there's...
Play this out though, because of course a martial poem, or a poem that acknowledges martial life, would say of, I presume this is gendered male, but we don't know that the person in the house is male, do we? We kind of assume so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't
But in
know
any
something,
case,
yeah.
this person definitely does not leave the house and
No.
does not march many miles to war and shows no valor.
Yes, although I'm wondering about it's the glassy portraits that I'm wondering if they're like a more glorious ancestry.
Definitely,
Yeah.
guys with swords in their,
Yeah. If it is, I mean, would that work in an American context?
Sure.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm also interested in the fact that the glass gets collapsed onto the portraits as well. Like there's a kind of, the image takes on the glassiness, the distance is like built in somehow to this kind of, being seen through, not registered somehow.
And clearly we need to, you're sending us to a kind of family history here of this person who's in this house, because we get a reference to the careful lowering of a frail body under churchyard gardens. Clearly what's happening is this is like a this is a traditional family.
Yeah.
So this is the nth generation. This is the end point, according to someone like Gregory, of a good American family stuck in his house, and he can't see what's going on around him.
And then ends up in the family mausoleum kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's. I mean, I think. Sorry, I don't know how helpful it is to talk about other, but it's the other poet that's in my head is Charlotte Mew. You know, in terms of a figure who was like sort of very stuck in a domestic setting and writing a lot about the one she talks about, like the light coming through the stairs, stabbing her, like knives coming. You know, the whole thing is fraught with this. If not menace, but I think menace, then at least mystery, and mystery is menacing in a way because of the unknown. But then what happens with this kind of it's the end. It's the last stanza where the house kind of falls apart. Is that a kind of revelation of what you know? Is that the throwing off of the shackles that's thrown as an alternative?
The wished for revolutionist's end. Well, let's turn to John on this.
Yeah, I want to hear more.
John, I want to
to
ask you. I mean, say anything you like at this point, because I'm sure you're thinking of it. There are bubbles over your head with all kinds of things. But one of the many things I hope you'll say has to do with the form of this poem. We've got 3 stanzas. It reads, as I read it, it reads like a certain lyric formalism, right? And he was certainly in control.
Yeah.
Of the poetic idiom.
Do you have the same stanzas?
Well, so this is I'm holding this is his collected from 19.
Can you hold it up?
Yeah, this is a collected from I think it's Reinhardt.
Will the camera catch the page itself?
Well, yeah, maybe it's from Reinhardt, 1964. He had 3 collecteds, a selected, a collected, or 2 collecteds and a selected in his life. Wow, say that 3 times fast.
And the stanza breaks are the same?
The stanza breaks are actually, he changed it. He changed it, so it's actually in just 2 stanzas on one page. But all the language is exactly the same.
So this is more systematic, the one in Poetry Magazine.
It's noteworthy that I have his other collected and selected, and it appears just like it did in the magazine in both of those. Right. So it's just a later career choice.
Let's go
with the poetry verse, because I mean I think that's how it appears in the book too, which is his first book, Chelsea Rooming House, which I think is the beginning of the decade.
Yeah. So tell us about the form of the poem, and does it interact with what we want to assume is the social critique?
I think that it does. I would say that it does, except in a way, again, I think he's sort of he's caught in this ensnarement of wanting to be a sort of a traditional poet.
Yes.
And
can you find some lines where it's clear he's wanting to be that?
I was talking earlier today about the usage of the word trembling. Which to me is striking. It's a word he uses a lot in his poetry.
It's a poetizing word.
It's a poetizing word, and a word that I feel like might have been frowned up. There's something. Trembling is an interest. It's a professorial choice.
And then there's the modernist, a conservative, modernist thing about the repetition of "there is no rest." There is no victory.
Yeah, there's no victory in the
rest, right? So it has this. Edwin Rolfe, who's a real communist in the 30s, used that kind of what I would consider to be easy, cheap lyric repetition to make you feel, right? In Rolfe's case, about homeless people or people who are begging on the streets.
I'm lowered carefully with the frail body under churchyard gardens. Is very churchyard gardens is to me is very Anglophile. Like
very much
it speaks to. It's not a phrase. It's not a New York school phrase.
It's the opposite of it. It reminds me of the very early Robert Lowell.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that. I think maybe it's because there's not a lot of photographs that I've seen of Horace Gregory. There's like maybe 10. I'm sure there's maybe more in existence, but 10 that I've had access to. And there's a resemblance to Lowell. They have a similar look. And I don't know.
New England look.
A New England look, although Gregory's Midwestern, but
right, Wisconsin, right?
He does, Wisconsin, but he doesn't. He seems so New England to me.
Is he? Well, I'll instead of asking a question that's leading, I'll just say, and then the two of you can react. He's trying really hard to write a poem for poetry. even though he's also trying really hard to be a social poet, and to condemn. So here's my take on form: to condemn the person, the figure, the protagonist of the poem, to condemn him for his suburbanizing limitations. But at the same time, the poem doesn't condemn suburbanizing limitations. It really does.
It doesn't.
Yeah. So the form is not radical. The content may be.
I think he's really suffering under the weight of that desire to really be political, and secretly or unconsciously even doesn't think that he should.
Well put. I think that's right.
And I think if you read his later work, his one book that is still like commonly available in print at like used bookstores is like from the 1970s. He lived till 1982, I think. It's like one of his last collection. It's very aesthetic. It's very like poetry from someone who's spent a lifetime memorizing and writing poems. And you can tell that he loves it. But so it's so different than this work that is so thinking about the conversations they're having today still about what is the virtue of poetry when it comes to politics. And
that is right.
And in the 30s, I think that there's this particular sense, because of the proletarian literature going on everywhere, that it needs to be political. You have this Soviet realisms going on, and there's this sense of like, in aesthetics, there's Lukács and Adorno, and everybody's arguing about realism and modernism, and Gregory's stuck right there in the middle. He wants both.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, it's a problem.
I want to say one more thing, just a general observation. Then I'm going to invite each of you, or maybe all three of us, will just finish up by 2 rounds. One round would be finding some evidence of what might be the tone, which is to say the attitude of the speaker toward the subject matter. Tone. Find some phrases that help us with tone. And then after that, we'll do final thoughts. The point I want to make is that instead of feeling condemnatory, I don't feel that way at all about Gregory. I see the problem, and he is expressing the problem. He's devoted to poetry, capital P, Poetry Magazine, and poetry in its ideal state, as it is in after the 20s. And he is also troubled by what poetry needs to do to stir up class consciousness. And this suburbanite is not helping things. So he is trying to be angry.
Yeah.
So I feel for him very much so. And I'll also say February 1930, well, it takes a few months to publish in poetry at best. So the poem was written before the crash of October 1929. Let us not forget, this is one of the earliest social poems of the 30s, of the Depression. It's about as early as it gets. So we need to cut him a little slack, because this is literally the moment when poets who had been inclined between the war years, inclined toward a social critique, didn't have any of the ideological tools, no affinity, particularly with the Communist Party of the United States, which was hardly a thing in 1930. It existed, but it wouldn't have been reaching out to poets like it will in 1934, 1935. So this is an incredible micro document of the moment. Okay, tone. Either of you got a phrase that helps us understand tone?
Maybe in a slouch hat. Like, is a slouch hat a thing, or is it personified?
Yeah, I think Whitman wore a slouch hat.
A slouch hat, okay.
Yeah, that photo of him at a rakish angle.
Yeah.
Is that a slouch hat?
That's a slouch hat, yeah.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm getting a double meaning in it, like, which is maybe picked up with some of the kind of other language of this kind of, what's the word, resignation that's kind of fitting through this life.
I like that. All right.
Way.
John?
I'm the second, or the sort of final, desperate valor, shattering the 4 walls, disintegrating human love.
What's the tone there?
there's this agony. It's like desperation is desperate valor, yearning. I think we have this sense of trapped, feeling trapped. There's this yearning for something more, or yearning for a ideological rupture. I think.
For me, the easiest way to understand tone of this poem is the last two words, fine morning. It's
Interesting.
not a fine morning. Right?
Yeah.
And fine morning is the way you end a poem because the sun is rising and we can start a new day.
But is fine morning like one of those platitudes that people say to each other? It's a fine morning.
It's a fine morning, yes.
Yeah.
So it's bitterly ironic, even
Yeah.
though it's also poetic in a way that Gregory probably congratulated himself on.
Okay.
That also makes me think of Wilfred Owen, of this sort of fine morning. I think that strange meeting. There's
Yeah.
something in there. Not fine. Maybe it's not exactly fine morning, but it sort of speaks to that.
Yeah.
The calm before something bad.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
or within something bad. Or
the critique, the ultimate Hollywood leftist critique of the Vietnam War is the line that Francis Ford Coppola gave to the colonel after napalm is dropped in the opening scene or the second scene of Apocalypse Now, where the guy says, "I love the smell of napalm in the morning," and it's a beautiful morning in Vietnam, you know. That was a stretch. Okay.
I liked it.
Thank you. Final thoughts. Who's got one? Anything you wanted to say about this that you haven't had a chance to?
Maybe there's just a thing that I'm curious about where God is and where religion is in relation to this poem and by extension to the politics of the of this moment. Like, you know, obviously starts like, you know, there's this looking for God. And the churchyard garden is at the end. There's a kind of movement from God to God through the poem in this kind of cosmic language and the solar magnitude, as I find that like a visionary moment. So I'm just trying to, like, you know, it's a question, isn't it? It's like, how, I guess maybe that's one of the questions running through this poem is how you kind of square individual visionary experience that tells you there's more than your immediate political reality with the political needs of the moment. Which is maybe another way of saying, like, how do you write poetry in times of crisis?
Yeah, and boiled down to a different question, synonymous question. Can you worry about the world from this position inside a house like that? You know, is there a way to properly assess what's going on from this position?
Because there certainly is a way to experience, because, you know, experience comes with being human. It's maybe like, how do you get into a position where you're able to experience and have your gears engaged or something?
Right.
But there's not nothing in this person's life. There is still, I would say, even from this poem, colour and you know, texture to the life that's being lived. You know, it's there in the egg at breakfast. I mean, the egg was enjoyed. I imagine. You know. It's not without taste, colour and movement. It's more just like, you know, does it need to rally? I mean, I'm glad you talked about Yeats earlier, because I think of Yeats's, what was it, Easter 1916 or whatever, the poem.
The famous one,
Yeah, where he's trying to make sense of the sacrifice of the lives of the martyrs, which he wasn't.
Right.
And it's like squaring that position and maybe...
Similar, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
The same kind of regret, I think, that Yeats had.
But
and
also,
Yeats also, I guess another version of my synonymous question is, can you have a visionary experience in a setting like this?
And I would say yes, you can. But
yes, definitely. The modernists certainly thought you can. John, final thought?
Yeah, well, I think poetry wants us to believe that, or proves that you can take anything and, you know, make a Grecian urn. It's beautiful because it's poetic, not because the suburbs are particularly interesting. At the same time, he doesn't shy away from the sort of like, I guess, like the Chantal Akerman thing, that like the suburbs are not spectacularly exciting. I think, just to do historicism one more time, I think when I think about these glassy portraits, he wrote a memoir called The House on Jefferson Street. And it's all about this house in Wisconsin that was owned by his uncle, who was the editor-in-chief to a small Milwaukee paper called The Evening Wisconsin. And in the uncle's house, there were these glassy portraits of armchair poets. I'm not going to remember who they are.
Really?
I want to
You
say
mean like nationally known armchair poets?
yeah,
not local poets.
not nobody that they
Like Longfellow and people like that.
maybe not. I think it would have been earlier because
Whittier.
this would have been like
Cullen Bryant.
1880s. So Bryant, yeah. Yeah, there's this sense of I think he titled his memoir at the end of his own life after his uncle's house. So I think it really deeply impacted him. And he's living in the suburbs when he's writing this with, I think, Zacherneska in
Near Sarah Lawrence,
near
maybe?
Sarah Lawrence. But I think he still has that house in his mind.
Oh, I love that. I love that.
So those might not be the portraits he's talking about, but I know that he mentions the portraits at the beginning of his memoir. So I think that they mattered to him.
You're making me think that the character in this poem is a version of Gregory, a little wistfully.
Could be.
Not that that matters ultimately. And who's around to do a biographical reading of Horace Gregory? I would say you and me. That might
That's it. Yeah.
For my final thought, I want to just look at the beginning of the second stanza for a second, and I just want to think it through. The mind sunk in quiet places, so, good and bad. There's a meditation on existence, but also sunk. So that's a kind of negative. So the mind is like gone down a little rabbit hole. Parentheses, like old heroes. So presumably this is a mind that's contemplating peace after war, like old heroes. Sleeps no more. So the mind can't stop doing its work, its thinking. Comma, but instead of that, instead of sleeping, walks abroad. Abroad would be outside the house, in a slouch hat, performing adultery at violent street corners.
what's
What the
that?
fuck?
You get to speak Ginsbergian there suddenly. It's like,
Yeah, what? And these violent street corners are a little early for 1930, but if I had $1 for every reference in a social poem or a communist poem of the 1930s that referred to an off-scene, off-stage, violent uproar of the people, I'd be wealthy. It would have to be $10 for everyone, but I'd be wealthy. In other words, so what is going on? You've got an old hero who can't sleep, puts on a slouch hat maybe to disguise himself, goes out, or maybe it's Whitman, goes out there but who's performing adultery? The mind. The mind, semicolon, then comes back to the house, trembling returns, and goes back to looking at the coffee cup.
Yeah.
That is what you call impotence.
Yeah.
In a Prufrockian sense.
Yeah. I get it. I think you're on it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, both of you. This was amazing, and I dare say there isn't another YouTube or ModPo video of any kind that you can find talking this long about a poem by Horace Gregory.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you both.
Glad to have been here.